Okay, hello everyone. Yeah, so I'm here to talk to you today about SVG. I've been doing a lot of writing and talking and a lot of writing again about SVG lately. And today what I want to talk about today is a primer, but not the kind of primer that gets you into the SVG syntax and elements and how to write SVGs. I want to talk more about stuff that you will hopefully find very useful if you want to start using SVGs in your projects today. Like, why would you want to choose SVG? When would you want to use SVG over other image formats? How to use SVGs. I have a few examples about how to create SVG sprites that you can use and stuff like that. So, first things first, SVG is just another image format. Just like we have PNG and JPEG, we also have SVG. And it's a very old image format and has been around since 1999. However, its rebirth today is due to the fact that we have a lot of high-density screens, retina screens. We are in a desperate need for an image format that looks great and crisp on all screen resolutions, so that we don't have to worry about providing different assets for different screen resolutions. And SVG is perfect for that. But why would you want to use SVG? How is SVG special from other image formats? What advantages does it have? The first advantage, and the most obvious one, is that SVG is scalable and resolution independent. No matter how many times you scale your SVG up, it's going to look crisp. If you use it in print, it's going to look crisp. If you use it on any image resolution, it's going to look crisp and great. This is because, unlike JPEG and PNG, SVGs are vector images instead of bitmaps, as opposed to bitmaps that are pixel-based images. You see, pixel-based images or raster images, they're made up of pixels, and so they are pixel independent. If you have an image is made up of a specific amount of pixels, and if you scale that image up, or if you view it on a high resolution screen, you need more pixels. So in order to display it at a bigger size, the browser has to create more pixels, and it does that in an approximation way. This approximation and the creation of new pixels is the reason why images look blurred on high resolutions or if you scale them up. SVGs are vector images, on the other hand. Vector images are made up of shapes that the computer is going to draw based on mathematical equations. So no matter where you draw that SVG, which resolution you view it on, how many times you scale it up, the browser is just going to redraw the image every single time without having to create pixels or be dependent on pixels at all. This is why SVGs look crisp and great no matter where you view them. SVG is human readable. When you create an SVG in any graphics editor and then you export it, you get to see the code of that SVG because it is made up of XML tags. And these XML tags are very conveniently named. You have elements, you have the G element, which is a group element. You have rectangles, circles, paths, a radial gradient, you have text. All of the elements in SVG are human readable. So even if you don't know SVG, if you just come from an HTML background, reading SVGs is going to be a lot easier than you think. Okay, before I get to this, I want to rephrase Chris Coyer when he said in one of his presentations, he said that you can learn SVG, but you cannot learn JPEG. You have control over individual elements in an SVG, but you don't have this control over JPEG, elements in a JPEG. You cannot interact with these elements, but in SVG you can do that. This is another advantage. Because SVGs are made up of XML text, they can be easily minified and gzipped. As mentioned in Wikipedia, an SVG-Z file, which is a file, an SVG that has been gzipped using gzip compression, is typically 20 to 50% of the original file size. This is a huge reduction in size. And the table that you can see here is from an appendix in the SVG specification that tells you about all of the features of SVGs that make it so great for compression. It has a lot of capabilities that make it, for example, the stats that you can see, these are several samples of several SVGs that have been compressed using gzip. You can see the compression ratios are very high, and this is perfect for performance, of course. The smaller the file size, the better. Now, in a lot of cases, SVG images are going to be smaller in size than JPEG and PNG images, but this is not always the case. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the size of the SVG, and based on these factors and based on these factors, you get to decide whether you can or is better that you use SVG or if you go with a PNG or a JPEG format. For example, the complexity of the image or the illustration. If the image contains a lot of details, a lot of paths, this is going to increase the size of the SVG. So in a lot of cases, complex images are better presented as PNGs instead of SVGs because SVGs can have a really big file size, which you probably don't want. Another thing is the dimensions. A while back, I was working on a few assets for an article that I was writing, and I exported an image from Illustrator. It was around 400 by 300 pixels. Of course, every time, most of the times, if you're creating an SVG and you want to use it on the web, you're probably going to also export a PNG version of that SVG so that you can provide it as fallback, right? So you're going to have the SVG and the PNG, and you get to compare between the two. When I first exported the SVG as a small size, the SVG was smaller than the PNG. But then I realized I wanted a bigger image. So I increased the dimensions in Illustrator and exported it. I ended up with the SVG being a lot heavier and bigger than the PNG. So these are all variables. And depending on these variables, the SVG may or may not be suitable for you. If the SVG contains a lot of graphics effects, blur effects, filters, and any kinds of effects, this is also going to contribute to the size. Generally speaking, raster images are better suited for continuous tone images. JPEGs, for example, are better suited for photos. If you take a photo, it's going to be JPEG. That's better than SVG. Smaller vector images like icons or simple illustrations are best candidates for SVG. But again, if the icons contain a lot of details, you may have to replace them with PNGs. Basically, all you have to do is just compare between the two and choose accordingly. If the SVG size is very big, you may want to have to drop it in favor of the PNG because, performance. Always test and then choose. SVGs have very good browser support. They are supported in all modern browsers. Browsers that don't support it are IE8-, and there is partial support in Android browsers. But we have a lot, and by a lot, I mean a lot of ways to provide fallback for SVGs, so non-supporting browsers are no longer a problem today. SVGs are accessible. This is one of the most important features of SVG. Generally, if you have a JPEG or a PNG and you want to make it accessible, one of the basic things that you do is just add an alt attribute to the image tag, right? SVG comes with a set of accessibility features that make it more accessible to screen readers. The SVG's accessibility specification, okay, the text is cut off, but it's okay. The important text is the one in pink here. You don't need to see the rest, it's okay. So the SVG specification defines two elements, title and desk. Again, as I said, SVG elements are conveniently named. They are easily readable even if you don't know what they are. Just by reading them, you get to know. The title and description elements allow you to provide a text alternative for screen readers, which is how you make it accessible. But these two elements are not interpreted and read by all browsers and screen readers the same way. So in order to enhance the accessibility of these elements, you can use ARIA labels, ARIA attributes, the role and the ARIA labeled by. These two attributes can be used to make the SVGs more accessible across different screen readers and browsers. Now, if you want to know more details about the inconsistencies and why these ARIA labels are used and stuff like that, I recommend these two excellent articles by Leonie Watson. She's a member of the HTML Accessibility Task Force. I took my time to memorize this, HTML Accessibility Task Force. Actually, she has more titles, but they were too many for me to memorize. Bottom line, she has these two excellent articles that I totally recommend if you want to learn more about accessibility in SVG. SVGs have Photoshop-like capabilities. If you have a JPEG or a PNG and you want to apply some kind of effect to it, you're going to have to do it in a graphics editor like Photoshop, for example. But SVG comes with a set of features, like we have linear gradients, blending modes, drop shadows, filters, blur effects, clipping and masking. We even have lighting effects in SVG. This comes built in. All you have to do is just write some simple code, and you have these effects. Again, one advantage over JPEGs and PNGs. SVGs are stylable and interactive. They can be styled and animated using CSS, kind of almost exactly just like HTML element. There are certain differences, browser bugs and stuff like that, which I unfortunately don't have the time to go over today. But you can style and animate SVGs with CSS. You can't do that for JPEGs and PNGs. You can script them using JavaScript. You can animate them using SMIL. But in the future, SMIL is going to be deprecated in favor of the Web Animations API, which has its advantages and disadvantages. You see, if an SVG is embedded as an image, I'm going to go over embedding techniques later, but if it's embedded as an image, SMIL can work. You can have animations work, but you cannot have JavaScript work. So if you define some animations using SMIL or using CSS, you can have them work. But scripting or the Web Animations API is not going to work, and that's for security reasons. So deprecating SMIL in favor of the Web Animations API is not really that bad, except that we're going to lose that feature of animations with SMIL inside an SVG as an image. But you can still use CSS, So if you want to know more about styling and animating SVGs with CSS, I recommend this article that I wrote for Smashing Magazine a while back. It contains everything you need to know: how to add the styles, what presentation attributes are styles, how to animate SVGs with CSS, browser box, and stuff that you would probably want to know. And if you're going to use JavaScript to animate your SVGs, I recommend using Snap SVG, which is a jQuery for SVG. It's going to make working with your SVGs a lot easier and save you a lot of headache. And if you're still interested in Smell, even though it's going to be deprecated, I've also written this guide for CSS tricks that you can read. And last but not least, using CSS, you can make SVGs cross-browser responsive, but there are certain fixes and hacks that you need to apply. This article contains everything you need to know. I've written about all of the fixes and hacks. You can also use media queries with CSS, and media queries in CSS are practically element queries, because if you apply a media query to an SVG, you can use media queries in SVG, not in CSS. CSS media queries in SVG are basically element queries, because when you specify in a media query, when you specify the width of the viewport, it's going to be the width of the viewport of the SVG, not the page. So if the SVG width changes, its styles are going to be applied, and this is basically element queries, and this is one of the most important and really great things about SVG. So again, everything you need to know about it in this article. Now, one of the most important things that you have to do if you're going to work with SVG is to optimize them. Optimize them as much as possible for many reasons. Number one, performance. Number two, to have clean, optimized, readable code that you can actually work with and use. There are many optimization tools. Now, if you use Adobe Illustrator, the screen is blurry, but it's okay. If you use Adobe Illustrator, once you want to save the SVG, once you have an illustration and you want to save it as SVG, you get this panel. This panel contains a set of options that allows you to export better code for the web. Some of these options are, for example, you get to choose the number of decimal points after the decimal point, obviously. Usually, 1 decimal point is more than enough. If you have more, it's going to increase the file size, so generally go for 1. Other options are you can choose if you want the styles to be applied as CSS or presentation attributes. One of the things that is generally recommended if you want to export your SVG is to turn the SVG text into outline. It has one major advantage, which is that you can avoid embedding the font inside the SVG, and this is always good, again, for performance. However, you need to remember that if you convert the text into outlines, it's not going to be readable, it's not going to be searchable or accessible anymore. SVG text can be read by screen readers. It's selectable, searchable, and accessible. But if you turn it into outlines, this means that the text is no longer going to be actual text. It's going to be made up of paths, and the paths make up the shape of the text. So you're practically turning the text into an image. It has its disadvantages, but sometimes, in some cases, for example, if you have a logo and this logo contains some text, you don't need this text to be accessible or searchable, so you can turn it into outlines. Again, pros and cons, depending on your needs, depending on how you're using your SVG, either convert to outline or don't. The SVG editor by Peter Collingridge is an online tool which also allows you to optimize your SVGs. The one advantage of this tool is, well, the way it works is you upload an SVG or you insert SVG code. You get to see a live result of your SVG, and on the left you have a set of options. These options are optimizations that you can apply to the SVG. You can choose what optimizations you can apply, and the most important part is that you get to see the result of applying those optimizations live. This is my favorite feature about this tool and the #1 reason why I use it today. There are better tools that you can integrate into your workflow, but this one has an advantage because sometimes certain optimizations that you apply to the SVG can end up breaking it. And of course, you don't want that. If you don't want to use an online tool, you can use the SVG-O. SVG-O is a Node.js-based tool, which again also allows you to optimize your SVGs. It is available as a Grunt plugin, as a Gull plugin, and it also has a nice drag and drop GUI. Well, SVG-O is great. It's perfect, but not really perfect. If you're going to use it, make sure you remember 2 things. The first one, do not use the default optimizations applied by the tool. There are some really bad optimizations, and then the #1 optimization applied that you don't want to apply and that you want to disable is removing the viewbox attribute. The viewbox attribute is one of the most important features of an SVG. If you remove it, it's going to mess up with a lot of things. If you want your SVG to be responsive, even if you apply the fixes and hacks that you need to, if you don't have a view box, it's not going to be responsive. I've had a lot of questions from developers also working with this. They have applied all of the fixes and hacks that I mentioned in the article, but then they ended up with an SVG that was not responsive. I always end up asking them, do you have the view box? They end up saying no. So always keep it, it's very important. SVGO removes it. But fortunately, if you're using SVGO, it comes with a set. Every optimization is actually a plugin, and you get to enable or disable any plugins that you want. So make sure you choose your optimizations well. And the second thing actually that I wanted to talk about is that you cannot tell if the optimizations you apply are going to break your SVG or not. So in most cases, in a lot of cases, a lot of developers, even in the README file of the SVGO itself, it says that it can break your SVG. So you're going to have to, if you've integrated it into your workflow, you have a folder of SVGs, and you're automatically optimizing them. Sometimes you may end up with broken SVGs and may have to re-optimize them again. This is the only disadvantage, and I hope that someday someone will come up with a way so that we can preview the result of the optimizations. Now, someone from Adobe also created this tool recently. Basically, what this tool, it's an alternative SVG exporter for Adobe Illustrator. Basically, it's SVGO inside Adobe Illustrator. You get to choose the optimizations that you want using a UI, which is perfect, a set of checkboxes. You can apply some optimizations and not others, but again, you can't tell if it's going to break your SVG. So you may end up optimizing, exporting, broken SVG, back, optimize again, export. If it's okay, yay. If it's not okay, you're going to have to re-optimize again. So this is the only disadvantage of SVGO, which is no live preview. So you can choose any of these tools, whichever works for you. In most cases, I don't usually use a lot of SVGs in my projects, so I don't need to use SVGO. I prefer using Peter's tool, just upload, optimize, live preview. You know, it all depends on your workflow and what you want to do. Now, this is my favorite part of this talk because there are a lot of things that I've been wanting to talk about, things that took me some time and a lot of reading to know, and hopefully, I hope you're going to find them useful. There are 6 ways to embed an SVG on a web page. The first one is using an image tag. Just like you can embed a PNG or a JPEG image, you can reference an SVG image just like that. Every technique, every embedding technique has its pros and cons. The major advantage of this one is that the image can be cached. It's going to require an extra HTTP request, but the image can be cached, which means that subsequent loads are going to be faster, which is always good. However, CSS interactions, like hover interactions, do not work when the SVG is embedded as an image. No scripting, no JavaScript at all, no interactions, no animations whatsoever. And CSS animations do work, but only if you specify them inside a style tag inside the SVG. If you have animations outside SVG, like in an external style sheet, they're not going to work. The same things, pretty much the same things, apply to an SVG that is embedded as a background image in CSS. The image can be cached because the style sheet is being cached. No CSS interactions, no scripting, and animations only work if they are specified inside the SVG. This is the oldest, probably the most, well, they're all standard ways, but this is the oldest and the one that has probably the most number of advantages. Using the object tag, you can also embed an SVG. It has a lot of advantages over other techniques. The first one is image can be cached, just like the image tag. It can be cached. You can apply JavaScript to it. You can script it, animate it, manipulate it with JavaScript any way you want. It comes with a default fallback mechanism. Between the opening and closing object tags, you can provide any kind of fallback that you want, be it text fallback or an image, a PNG image as a fallback, so that if a browser does not support SVG, it's going to render the fallback instead. CSS animations and interactions both work only if they are defined inside the SVG. Now, one important thing here, if you're going to use object, and if you want to provide an image fallback, you're probably going to want to do it like this. The image between the opening and closing tags, PNG fallback, great. However, this is bad. Don't do it. If you want to provide a fallback, don't do it this way. It's not wrong. It's definitely not wrong. It's just bad for performance. SVG-capable browsers that do support SVG, are going to request and render the SVG image, but they are also going to request and download the PNG image. So you're going to end up with multiple downloads. You don't want that. That's bad for performance. So a workaround was seen on the ClearLeft website. They used it in one of their logos, and David Busher wrote about it in one of his articles. Basically, what they do here Instead of providing an image tag, which is going to cost an extra HTTP request, they add a div, and they apply the fallback image as a background for that div. Now, why does this work? This works because if a browser does not support SVG, it's going to ignore the SVG, the object tag, and it's going to render the div with the styles perfect. It's going to be there. If a browser does support SVG, it's going to request and render the SVG, but it's going to ignore the styles for the div inside the object tag, which means that it's not going to need the styles for the fallback div. So it's not going to request the background image. We end up with only one request, one SVG displayed, and this is what we want. Okay? Again, this is better for performance. The fourth way to embed an SVG is using an iframe. It has a lot of the same features of the object tag. It also comes with a default fallback mechanism. However, scripting the SVG, if it is included in an iframe, is going to be a little harder, and it's subject to the same origin policy. So if you have an iframe referencing an SVG on your website, they have to be on the same origin. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to script it using JavaScript. The embed tag, well, I would say don't use it, but I'm not sure if someone still has a use case for it. It's very old. It had its uses in the very past. Basically, it was introduced because of plugins like Flash plugins and stuff like that. I don't know if, I don't believe if anyone's still using it now. I don't think anyone is, so I'm not going to spend any more time on this. You can also embed the SVG inline. You have an SVG code, export it from Illustrator, whatever, take the SVG, literally just put it inside your page, and you have the SVG rendered. This is inlining. It has many advantages, but the number one disadvantage is that it cannot be cached. The image cannot be cached, so the browser has to render it and go over its code every single time. You can script it, JavaScript work, CSS animations and interactions work, whether they are specified inside or outside the SVG. No extra HTTP requests, but again, no caching. Again, a lot of times I get questions, which technique do you prefer? Which one should I use? I always end up saying it depends on what you want to do. If you want CSS interactions to work, you're not going to embed it as an image. If you want CSS animations only, you can embed it as an image, but then you will not be able to use JavaScript. If you want JavaScript, opt for the object tag. It can also provide you with a fallback mechanism and stuff like that. So it all depends on what you want to do. If you're just displaying a static image, go for the image tag. If you want scripting, the pros and cons of each technique, the best way to do anything actually on the web is if you have a lot of techniques, a lot of things, we are always overwhelmed by the number of techniques and tools online, right? So the best way is to just see the pros and cons of each one, and whatever fits your workflows best, just go with that. No technique is better than another. Seriously, it just depends on what you want to do. Now, all of the previously mentioned techniques allow you to use data URIs. Okay, so what are data URIs? Inlining SVGs using data URIs is basically having the image inside the document so that the browser does not have to request it from somewhere else. A data URI looks something like this. Instead of giving a reference to an SVG somewhere, you drop the data URI of the SVG inside. The data URI format starts with the data element, then the type of the format, and in our case it's an image, an SVG image, and then comes the encoding and the actual image. The encoding can be base64 or UTF-8 or whatever. A lot of developers prefer the base64 approach. I really don't know why. I cannot think of any advantage for base64 really. I know that a lot of developers disagree with me because we've had a conversation on Twitter once, and people were with it and some people were against it, but the web professionals that have been really doing this for a long time usually do not recommend that you use base64. And with SVGs, my personal recommendation, do not use base64. When an SVG is encoded as base64, the file size is going to increase. And this also applies for other image formats as well, but we're going to be talking just about SVG. If an SVG is encoded as base64, Chris Collier did some tests, and an image that was like 100%, for example, in size became 130%. This will increase, especially if you have the image inlined inside CSS. It's going to increase the size of the CSS file. And CSS is render blocking, which means that it's going to take more time for the browser before it renders your actual content on the page, which you do not want to do. In addition to that, not only does base64 does have a lot of disadvantages, you can, instead of encoding the SVG, you can just drop the SVG inside there. You can just drop it in there and just specify the encoding to be UTF-8. So you have data, image format, UTF-8, and then your SVG. This way, you have the SVG inside your document without having to encode it as base64. You avoid all of the disadvantages. Another advantage of inlining the SVG like this is that it gzips a lot better. It becomes a lot smaller once you apply gzip to your page. So probably don't base64 SVGs. This is the article that Chris Coyer wrote. You can read it. He talks about inlining using data URIs, base64 advantages, disadvantages, and why you probably do not want to base64 SVGs. Now, just like you can inline the SVGs in the HTML document, you can also use data URIs to inline the SVG in your CSS. But again, as I mentioned, this is going to increase the file size of your style sheets, of course, which means that you're adding to the render blocking styles, which you may or may not want to do. I'll talk a little bit more about these later. So 6 embedding techniques. You can use data URIs with any of them. However, my recommendation is, based on a lot of research that I have read, generally, if an image is less than 4 kilobytes in size, you can inline it in CSS without having to worry about performance. Another thing is the number, depending on the number of images that you have. Like a lot of people, I'm talking about this because a lot of developers love inlining SVGs or images in general inside CSS. They think that it's easier to maintain, it's better. Yes, it is convenient. However, sometimes it has a very bad effect and impact on performance. So again, always test, test, test. And based on your tests, what's better for performance, go for that. SVG sprites. Okay, so SVG is great. It looks better almost everywhere you put it. Icon fonts, suppose you have an icon system and you're using icon fonts. Icon fonts have a lot of disadvantages. A lot of disadvantages. I remember I've used them only once or twice ever since I started doing this whole thing. And I honestly don't like them. I ended up removing all of the icons from my website just because I hated icon fonts. This is the first time I've ever said this. But I really hate icon fonts. And SVGs make up for a superior icon system for many reasons. Again, Chris Coyer wrote a cage match article comparing icon fonts to SVG icons. His article is like the go-to article that you should read if you don't know which one to choose. SVG is superior. I recommend it myself. Of course, there are certain things like browser support to keep in mind, but SVG has a lot more advantages over icon fonts. Some of these advantages are SVGs are more semantic. You have control over SVG icons styling. Like you can have multicolor icons in SVG. If you want to have multicolor icons using icon fonts, there is this weird technique that uses stacking on top of each other. It's, you know, why would you want to do that? SVG icons can be animated and interactive. You can animate them and interact with them. The only kind of animation that I can think of for icon fonts is a simple hover effect, changing the color. That's lame, kind of. You can provide a PNG fallback for SVG. If your SVG icons are not displayed, you have a PNG fallback, yay, but icon fonts, you don't have that. SVGs are generally more consistent across browsers. Icon fonts have all kinds of problems that you're going to have to fix. They're easier to create, embed, and maintain. Creating icon fonts is a hustle, and SVGs are accessible. Again, this is one of the most important features of SVG. Your icons are going to be accessible. So for even more advantages, refer to Chris's article. Okay, so you're 100% convinced you want to use SVG. Great. How do you start? The first thing is, okay, suppose you have created a set of icons in Illustrator. Every icon, by the way, I'm not, even if I sound like I know what I'm talking about when I talk about Illustrator, I'm not. So I'm not the best designer. I don't call myself a designer at all. So, but I know that if you have a set of icons that you're creating in Illustrator, every icon is better. It's better if every icon has its own artboard. And then you export those icons, and every artboard is going to be an individual SVG. So you have like 3 artboards, 3 icons. They're going to be exported as 3 separate SVGs. Now, I want to talk about something before I move on. The size of the artboard, which is the size of your SVG, is going to determine the viewport and the viewbox of the SVG. Now, okay, I'll talk about it when I get to it, just so I don't make things more complicated. So you start with a folder, and this folder contains all of your SVGs. Okay, next. The next step is to create your SVG sprite. There are many ways, and by many, I mean really many ways to create SVG sprites. The 2 most common ones that you're probably going to see if you search for SVG sprites, the first one is HTML inline SVG sprite. Okay, so first of all, we have to so how many of you are familiar or have used CSS image sprites, the PNG type, before? Okay, so how many of you know what an image sprite is? Okay, good. So basically an image sprite is just one image. Instead of having a lot of icons and therefore a lot of HTTP requests, you have only one image, and that image contains all of your icons, and then you display that one image. The browser, all the browser has to do is just request that image and then display only parts of it. So there's only one HTTP request is going to be cached, and whenever you need an icon, the browser is going to display that icon from the sprite. So what we're going to do in SVG is we're going to have a main SVG, the main SVG that's going to contain all of the other icons. Then you have the icons in the folder here. Just imagine it's somewhere here. And then you have an SVG, the main SVG that's going to be the sprite here. You take every single icon from your folder, the code of that icon, and you drop it inside a symbol element. The symbol element in SVG, what it does is it is used to define a symbol, which is a perfect a description of an icon, kind of. It is used to define a symbol, define an element, anything actually, and without rendering it on the screen. If you have this code in your page, you're not going to see anything because the symbol element is not going to be rendered. In order to render it, you're going to have to use it next, and this is what we're going to do next. So you have a set of icons, drop each icon inside a symbol element, give it an ID, and you have your SVG sprite. Now, the next step is, since we're talking about HTML inline sprite, is you just put this sprite in your page, whatever you want. It is generally better if you put it at the top because there is a bug in WebKit that if you put the SVG, if you define the icons at the bottom of the page and reference them somewhere above that, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in Safari and iOS, I think. So it's better if you just drop the SVG, include it at the top of your page, and then reference it later. The way you reference each icon inside that SVG is using the SVG use tag. You see, SVG elements are conveniently named, and the use tag is used to literally use something that you have defined somewhere before. So what we're doing here is we're just referencing the ID of the icons that we defined here, and this is just going to display whatever icon you have. You've defined all of the SVGs at the beginning, all of the icons at the beginning of your document, and if you want the Twitter icon in the footer, for example, you just drop this code in the footer and you have it. Now, so that in order so that you don't have to do this manually, so that you don't have to go grab the code for each icon and create the SVG sprite yourself, Fabrice Weinberg created this Grunt SVG store. My favorite part about this is not really actually the plugin itself, but in the README file, he says, you know, there's always a why. Why has this plugin been created? He says because Chris asked for it. Chris Coyer asked for it. So he created it. What this plugin does is it takes your SVG file. It's a Grunt plugin, so you should be using you would have to be using Grunt. What it does, it takes all of your SVGs in your folder and it creates this SVG sprite for you. And all you have to do is just include it and use it. It even uses the symbol element as here. And you know, this is what I was talking about before when I mentioned the view box. The view box is very important in SVG, and I would need literally an hour to explain everything about the view box. And yeah, it just needs a lot of time. But once you get a grip of how it works, I literally felt like I had SVG superpowers as soon as I grasped it. Seriously, I really recommend that you get to know it. I've written a long article that I can give you a link to at the end of the talk. It's seriously more extensive than the SVG specification itself, and I totally recommend it, not because I wrote it, but because I really put my heart into it. There are a lot of visual explanations and interactive demo and everything. Once you get a grip of how the viewbox works, you're going to find working with SVG a lot easier. Now, the viewbox that you have to include with the symbol element, if you don't want to get into the viewbox, you don't want to learn about it, you're not interested, it's okay. Basically, the syntax is probably in most cases going to be just 0, 0, 35, 35. The 35, 35 is just the dimensions of the artboard of your icons. Now, SVG Store, this plugin, when it creates your sprite for you, it's going to create the viewbox and everything, so you don't have to worry about it. Now, a better way, we said before that SVG, what we did is we included it inside the document and then referenced each individual icon. However, ideally, we would be able to do this. We would reference an external SVG file and then select individual elements in that file. Again, this is better because the SVG sprite will then be cached, which is always better. However, this does not work in any version of IE. Specifically, IE does not allow that you reference an external SVG inside the use tag, which, you know, IE. But IE is getting better, you know, to be fair. It's getting really, really better. but it's still, this one is still doesn't, it's not supported in any version. So Jonathan Neal created the SVG for Everybody plugin. This plugin allows you to use this syntax anywhere you want without having to worry about IE. And not only that, but it will also replace your, excuse me. It's going to replace your SVG code with PNG fallback. So not only does it allow you to use this in IE, but it will also provide fallback for non-supporting browsers. However, the one thing that it does not do is it does not create the PNGs. You're going to have the PNGs available, which I think it would be okay, because if you're creating the SVG icons yourself, you're going to have a PNG version anyway. If you're using an online application like iCommune, it also allows you to download your PNG versions. So this plugin is really great if you want to use it. All you have to do is just have the SVGs and the PNGs at the same time, and you can create your SVG sprites with ease. Another way to create, this is the last point, by the way. Another way to create SVG sprites is, instead of creating the SVG sprite inside the page, just like we did before, instead of having the icons available in an SVG, you have the icons inside the style sheet. So the style sheet is basically the sprite. The style sheet is the sprite, you have all of your icons inside it, and the icons will probably generally be included inline using data URIs as well. The fallback for the first one is referencing the SVG inline. The fallback for that one is to provide the PNG as a fallback. But certain versions of IE, I think it's 6 and 7, do not support base64 encoding inside CSS. So you're going to have to provide a fallback for the fallback, like this, as a regular PNG. This is not, well, yes, it can be a hustle. However, the folks at the Filament Group have created the grunt icon. It's one of the most famous tools out there for creating SVG sprites. Grunt icon takes care of everything, pretty much everything for you. All you have to do is just have your SVGs. It's going to create your PNG fallbacks for you, create the code that you need, the style sheets that you need. There is a script that you just add to the top of your page, and it's going to then replace whatever, depending on the browser support, it's going to check for browser support and then provide the style sheet that you need. It takes care of everything for you. Now, if you're not using Grunt, if you don't want to use Grunt, they've created this tool for designers who are not interested in Grunt, which is GrumpIcon. All you have to do here, again, is just drop your SVGs inside the app, and then it provides you with all of the files, the style sheets, the scripts, and even the PNGs. Then you download them and use them. You don't have, really, it's a very, very simple workflow. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to SVG than I talked about today. Seriously. There's a lot about the syntax, a lot of techniques. There are more techniques for providing fallback, more techniques for creating sprites. There are even standard ones that come with the SVG specification. So if you want to learn more about SVG, I recommend CSS Tricks. Chris Collier wrote a lot of articles about SVG, and they're excellent, as are all of his articles. You can also reference articles on Smashing Magazine, of course, on Codedrops. Manuela from Codedrops creates the most beautiful and impressive demos, I think, on the entire web. So do check her demos out. And I have a lot of articles on my website as well. Seriously, do read them, please. These slides are available at this link. And we do have a lot of time. I thought I was going to be out of time. So we do have a lot of time for questions. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone? Nobody likes SVG, huh? Well, I'm going to be around during, okay. I can't hear you. The mic? Okay. Yep.
Hi, it's a question regarding the performance of the SVG sprite. If you place it on the top of the document.
Which one, the HTML sprite or the CSS sprite?
The SVG sprite.
The SVG sprite, well, I don't think it's going to affect the performance if you put it at the top or at the bottom. I think it's going to be pretty much the same.
Okay, because some SVGs are going to be rendered after the DOM, or?
Well, it is probably preferable if you load it after the DOM, yes, but again, there's this bug with WebKit, so a lot of, depending, if your SVG is small, you're not going to have to worry about it anyway, but if you do have a lot of images, then yeah, that might be a problem.
Okay, because it's not possible to place it with JavaScript or something like that.
Well, it is possible to place it, yeah, but you need to, well, yeah, it is possible, but again, if you define the SVG sprite after using it, it's not going to work in Safari.
Okay.
That's the only disadvantage. Otherwise, then, yeah, just drop it at the bottom of the page and you should be fine.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
So my question was more about the scripting. And building dynamic SVGs. Is there any tool that you would recommend, like D3, or that you, in your experience, has been good for doing this kind of stuff?
I haven't done a lot of scripting with SVGs yet, but I know that D3 is one of the most popular ones, yeah. And the only thing I've done is with animations, which is why I recommended Snap SVG. But I do know, and I do see a lot of people recommending D3, so D3. Yeah, do give it a try.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Anybody else?
Hi, my question is, do you have any documentation or research done about localizing text in SVG and supporting BiDi enablement, for example?
Could you repeat that?
Do you have any documentation or research done about localizing text?
Localizing text?
Yeah.
What do you mean localizing?
Let's say you have an icon
and
displaying in BiDi languages like Hebrew, Arabic.
No, I've never done that before.
All right,
no.
okay.
Hi. I'd say one of my questions is about D3. You know the library too?
Yeah,
but I don't know if you can use custom SVGs, because you can make some easy shapes and so on, but how is the interaction with, or it doesn't have to be D3, it can be another library that you can use, like Snap or something like that.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting the question.
Okay, it's like, can you recommend us one library with custom SVGs? Like I draw something and I put it in an SVG?
Drawing?
Okay.
No, I can't really. Just like I said,
Básicamente, sí. Con SVGs que tú tienes, ¿vale? Que no sean shapes ni nada por el estilo, como es esa interacción, que si hay alguna librería buena para hacerlo, porque con D3...
Cuando dices que no son formas, ¿a qué te refieres? ¿A que son, por ejemplo, imágenes?
Que tú tengas una ilustración, la tengas en SVG y quieras interactuar con D3 para hacer cosillas, que generalmente siempre los ejemplos son...
Okay, this one should be...
I'm going to be around during the break, and I always welcome questions on Twitter. That's what I wanted to say. Even if whether you follow me or not, I always get questions. I'm always more than happy to help if and when I can. So feel free to shoot the questions, not shoot me. Shoot the question. Shoot any questions anytime. They're always welcome. Whether you follow me or not, just, anytime. Okay? Thank you.